Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today, it's the last in our short series of conversations about great political fictions, but this one is a bit different. I'm not going to be talking to someone who is a fan of the work in question. In this case, I'm the fan, and I'm going to be talking to the person who wrote the work in question. It's Tim Rice, who wrote the book, The Lyrics, for his and Andrew Lloyd-Webber's magnificent musical about the life of Eva Peron, the timeless Evita. Before we get to my conversation with Tim Rice, I did want to say a bit about why I'm so interested in Evita, or why I've come to be so interested in Evita, and particularly interested in what it has to say about politics, because I'm aware for some people that might seem like a stretch. As you'll hear, the musical's been around for nearly 50 years now. I've been aware of it for most of my life. And like most people, I first came to know of it, not as a musical, but there were hit pop songs that came from it before the musical had even been staged. The first one, the most famous one, Don't Cry For Me, Argentina, was the number one in Britain in 1976 when I was 9. And I remember it well. It was everywhere on the radio. And it was completely baffling. I had no idea what it was about. What did it have to do with Argentina? I think for a while I thought it was about football. And then I also remember quite distinctly another hit at the time that the musical was launched in the West End, which was by David Essex, who I did know about as a child. He was a kind of cheesy, cheeky chappy pop star. And his one was called Oh, What a Circus, and he seemed to be singing it as someone called Che Guevara. Again, completely baffling to me. These are the lyrics of the beginning of that song, just to give you a flavour of it. Oh, what a circus, oh, what a show. Argentina has gone to town over the death of an actress called Eva Peron. We've all gone crazy, mourning all day, mourning all night, falling over ourselves to get all of the misery right. Oh, what an exit, that's how to go. When they're ringing your curtain down, demand to be buried like Eva Peron. It's quite a sunset and good for the country in a roundabout way. We've made the front pages of all the world's papers today. So now I can see that that is genius. At the time, I just thought it was completely mad. I did not understand what this song was about. I saw the film of Evita, like a lot of people did, nearly 20 years later, mid-90s. And I really liked it. I was very taken with it. But again, I think like most people, the thing that stood out about it was that it starred Madonna as Evita. There was a lot of mockery beforehand about the casting of Madonna as Evita, but it turned out to be brilliant casting. And she was great in it. You know, she was what I was interested in. I don't think then I was thinking much about the politics. It's only much more recently that I've become really fascinated by Evita, the musical. And I listen to it a lot as a musical, as a soundtrack. Usually the Madonna version, because it's the best version. I saw it last year, staged, and I do now know a lot more about the politics. And I find it fascinating because in a very condensed form, it manages to tell the story of a very complicated political life. Not, I think, in a way that would meet the standards of academic history, any more actually than Hamilton meets the standards of academic history, but in a way that is coherent and compelling and captures something that academic history probably misses. What it does brilliantly, and Hamilton does the same, but Evita does it in many, many fewer words. The total lyric is actually relatively brief compared to Hamilton, which is massive. What it does is it weaves together a personal story and a political story, and it shows the relationship between the personal and the political, which I would say is often the essence of great political fiction. I think it's one of the themes that I've been talking about in this series. But I'm also fascinated by it because it does seem to capture something about a particular version of politics, not an ideology. It's not an ideological musical. I don't know what an ideological musical really would be like. Not much fun, I imagine. But it's something more than a political style. There are words that are attached to the kind of politics that the Perons, Juan and Eva Peron, came to embody. Actually, they gave their name to a version of politics, something less than an ideology and more than a style, Peronism. But Peronism, I'm not sure it really translates much outside of Argentina. Sometimes it's described as a form of fascism, but I don't think that that's right. What it is, I think, clearly is a version of populism. And Evita the musical captures something essential, I think, about populism, which is not an ideology, but is something more than a style. And what it captures is that populism isn't really about authenticity. It's not a version of political authenticity. And Eva Peron was not an authentic political character. I talked to Tim Rice about this, and you'll hear it in a moment. She was fake. There was something essentially fake about her, and part of the point of his lyric was to capture her fakeness, including in the anthem, Don't Cry for Me, Argentina. It's not the politics of authenticity, but it is the politics of connection. It is the connection that she had with the people of Argentina, partly because she came from them. But of course, by the time she was making that connection with them as the wife of Juan Perón, she was a million miles away from her roots. Her journey from her roots is staggering. And it takes your breath away because it's such a journey. When she's making her connection with the people, she's nothing like them anymore. She's rich, she's famous, she's powerful, she's living a remote life, and yet the connection is real. There are some great lyrics where she effectively says to the people of Argentina, you can know that my husband loves you because he loves me, and I'm one of you. And that's the logic of my politics. And it is both nonsense. It doesn't really mean anything. Of course, that love doesn't translate. And it's completely compelling. And then I became interested in Evita for another reason, which is when I discovered relatively recently, actually, I think shortly after he left the presidency, though this information had been in the public domain far longer, I think he first wrote about it in 2004, that Donald Trump was a huge fan of Evita and that he had been to see it multiple times when it first opened on Broadway in 1979. So when Trump had first seen it, he would have been relatively young. He only really became a figure in American public life long before he became a figure in American political life in the 1980s. He would have been a young real estate developer when he first saw Evita, but he went back to it over and over again, and he clearly saw something in it. And when I discovered this, I found myself thinking and wondering over and over again, what did he see in it? And is Donald Trump's love of Evita the key to understanding him? People who listen regularly to this podcast will know I spend quite a lot of time, including in this series, on political fictions, trying to find links to, maybe even answers to the mystery of Donald Trump. I don't think I've got there yet. I'm fascinated by him. I'm fascinated by the hold he has on the politics of our time, not just in the United States. And I still wonder what it was that he saw in Evita long before he became even the first version of Donald Trump, the public figure. And that touches on, I think, the other reason why it's such a fascinating political account of a life, which is its central theme. And I think when you hear the conversation with Tim Rice, you'll hear that Tim Rice probably also thinks this is its central theme, is the relationship between celebrity and a version of political power. And the two are clearly often connected. They have some basic connection in almost all cases. People who are very powerful in politics become famous. And many people who become famous directly or indirectly can acquire power, not always political power, but a form of power. But in the case of Eva Peron of Evita, it's a much closer match than that. She was a celebrity politician, and her celebrity was the basis of much of her power. She was famous, not as famous as she wanted to be, but she was famous before she became the First Lady of Argentina. When she became the First Lady of Argentina, her fame metastasized and it became an international phenomenon, though it didn't quite, I think, as we discussed, reach England. Not my England anyway, not until Tim Rice made her famous. But she had a particular kind of celebrity, which has more in common in many ways with movie stars or pop stars than it does with conventional politicians. And one of the differences between that kind of celebrity and the political fame that comes with the acquisition of political power through a conventional political route is that that second version of fame takes time. It's a grind. Most politicians who reach the top have to fight to get there, and it can take decades, including a lot of fighting when you're not famous, obscure backstage plotting and fighting and scheming and the doing of good things or bad things. The fame, real political fame in a political career, unless you do something catastrophic or notorious, tends to come towards the end. But that other kind of celebrity, which is embodied by Eva Peron, including before she entered politics, can be much quicker. It can descend on someone much more suddenly. It's more fickle. Fame is more fickle. Politics has been described as show business for ugly people. I don't know if that's true, but it's definitely not true of Eva Peron because she wasn't ugly. She had that other kind of fame. And the B-side to the David Essex single that I remember, though I don't remember it being the B-side, this was when records were released in vinyl form as 7-inch singles. There was an A-side and the B-side. The A-side was what was played on the radio. The B-side was to put something on the other side of the plastic. Occasionally, it got picked up by the radio and the record got flipped and the B-side became the A-side. Not in this case, though somewhat surprisingly, because the B-side to Oh, What a Circus is one of the great songs in Evita, one of the great songs in musical theatre, High Flying Adored, sung by David Essex as Che Guevara. In Evita, he's singing it to her at the height of her initial burst of fame in Argentina that's going to become a global fame as the wife of Juan Perón, as this glamorous figure who seems to have a connection with the ordinary people of Argentina who are beginning to worship her, eventually to worship her as a kind of saint, but at this point to worship her in the way they might worship a movie star who has found herself suddenly at the heart of their political system and is making them promises about the ways in which she will represent them at the heart of the nation. And David Essex, as Che Guevara, sings to her a song about the perils of that kind of fame. And it's not a song about the perils of political fame. The perils of political fame are well known. The people can be fickle. You can win an election and lose an election. The other perils of political fame in Argentina in this time are ones that Eva and Juan Perón spend quite a lot of time talking about, which is the peril of getting a bullet in the back of your head. You know, you can be at the height of your power and it can be over in an instant if you make a mistake. And in the musical, Eva is tougher about this than her husband. He wants to get out at various points, and she thinks that if you stay one step ahead, the prize will be yours. But High Flying Adored is a song about what can happen to you if you're a kind of movie star politician. And this also has something in common with Donald Trump, who, after all, didn't arrive at the pinnacle of political power because of the grind of his political career. He was a celebrity politician in the sense that before he was a politician, he was just a celebrity. The election that he won in 2016 was the first election he had ever fought. But in the decade leading up to that, and before that, I mean, he was very famous in the 1980s, but he was kind of New York famous. But in the decade before, a bit more than a decade before he became president, he was a massive TV star. The Apprentice was a huge show. It was the number one show in America. He was obsessed, Trump. I think he still is obsessed with its ratings and furious when it went down in the ratings, and also absolutely furious that he didn't win all the Emmys that he thought that he deserved. But he was a massive star. He was a star in the way that Eva Peron was a star. And it was from there that he went into politics to become, I think, probably now, although it's hard to measure these things, the most famous human being on the planet, which is immensely gratifying for him. Maybe he isn't. And it's thought that one of the reasons he has a love-hate relationship with Taylor Swift is he sometimes suspects that she's more famous than he is. I'm not sure that she is. Maybe she is. But he's got pretty good name recognition everywhere, which some people think has always been his goal in politics. He isn't a world-famous politician because he was a politician who became famous. He's a world-famous politician because he's a famous person who became a politician. And yet the difference, of course, with Eva Peron is that for her, it happened at the start of her life. In High Flying Adored, Shay reminds her she's only 26 and there's a long way to fall. And indeed, there's a long life ahead of her, though, as we know, she didn't get to live it. And it was disease that got her in the end. With Trump, it's happened at the end of his life, so it looks very different. And yet the moment of political fame is relatively brief in the same way, in that there was no political fame for Trump even in January 2015. It was known that he had political ambitions, and they were laughable in January 2015. Even when he launched his candidacy, they were borderline laughable, and a lot of people laughed at them. And they went from laughable to inevitable, the fulfillment of those ambitions, quite quickly. But people laughed before it happened. In a way, they laughed at Eva Peron. The snobbery, the ridicule, which is captured in the musical, was there for all to see until the joke was on them, as indeed the joke has been on Trump's critics often and repeatedly. I don't know, but there's a part of me that thinks that when Trump saw Evita in 1979, he glimpsed something of this, something of the overlap in the giant Venn diagram that has celebrity in one circle and political power in the other circle. There are lots of different ways in which those circles intersect, but one of them is the Eva Peron story. And in a million ways, the Donald Trump story is not the Eva Peron story, but in one or two ways it is. I don't know. I wonder if that's what he saw. There's lots else to say as well, and I'm going to be talking to Tim Rice about that too. As I was reading up on this before I spoke to him, I had some awareness that Margaret Thatcher had seen Evita and liked it, but I didn't know the details. And as you'll hear, the details are fascinating. Here's another politician, a world historic figure, who saw something in this musical and would not have seen it if Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd-Webber had not made it a musical, because Evita is now people's way in to the story of Eva Peron. One last thing to say, which is I'm conscious, and I was conscious as I was speaking to Tim Rice, one of the perils of speaking to the people who wrote the thing that you're talking about. This is the only instance of it. So we don't have an interview with George Eliot or Robert Louis Stevenson. And if we did, they might have reacted a little bit like I sense Tim Rice reacts at one or two points in this interview, which is maybe I'm reading more into it than he's comfortable with. Authors are sometimes less invested in the analysis of their work than the people who come to them to analysing it. Maybe George Eliot would have told me that I was going a bit far. I don't know. And I'm fine with it, because the other thing that you'll hear in this interview is, as well as analysing the politics behind Evita, I really am a fan. Tim, I've heard you talk in the past about the chance, almost serendipitous way you came across the story of Eva Peron, but maybe you could just remind us, how did you come across her and first hear about her story?
Well, I first heard about her when I was about 7 or 8, when I collected stamps as a child. And she was on the Argentine stamps, and they were rather attractive stamps and seemed rather efficiently organized in color and order and everything. So I knew that she was Argentine, and I also knew that she died. But that was about all I knew. But there was something about her name that resonated, and I heard a radio program by chance on the car radio when I was late for a dinner. And had I had sat-nav, I would have probably been on time. But sat-nav didn't exist in 1974 when I was heard this radio program. And so I heard the program in the car and was immediately taken back to being 8 or 9. And I thought, oh, that's the lady I knew something about. And I thought, what a fascinating story. And at the time, Andrew and I were wondering what to do as a follow-up to Superstar, which is quite a hard act to follow. Then I heard the Eva Peron thing. I thought, this is a good story. And I went off and did some research for about a year in various ways, including a trip to Argentina. And the more I learned about her, the more fascinated I became. And again, with the whole history of Latin America and the disaster of Peronism and all that, because Argentina was such a successful, wonderful country for so long. It still is a wonderful country, but it was very rich and it worked. And under the Perons, it kind of went down the tubes. It took a bit of time for them to do it, but they managed it in the end.
And when you heard that Radio 4 program, what was the spark? So what kind of a story did you think you would be able to tell as a musical? Was it about her? Was it about them? Was it about Argentina?
Well, it was all three, but primarily about her. I mean, she just struck me as being a fascinating character. And the more research I did, the more I was fascinated. And what was interesting to me was that the follow-up program in that series was James Dean. And it was a series not about Latin America, but a series about great stars, heroes of our time type thing. And to equate Eva Peron with James Dean, I found very interesting. In my mind, they had similarities, but it was something that I was surprised that a radio series equated. And I wouldn't say that was the clincher, but it certainly made me think there's a lot more to Eva Peron than just a bit of history, which I think there is.
And how much were you worried about the politics? So as you said, Peronism in many ways, and you were writing this in the mid-70s, was a disaster. Were you worried the politics would get in the way?
Well, she was a disaster way before the mid-70s. She died in 1952. So it was already history. Funnily enough, Peron himself came back in 1974 for a brief reprise, which was a total stopgap. He was only around for under a year, I believe. And when I went out there in 74 to do some research, he was actually on the throne, or not on the throne, obviously, but he was actually in power. And I rather wish I'd had the guts to say, any chance of an interview, I'm a great fan. It would be wonderful to, I wasn't a fan, but he might well have fallen for it. There again, he might have thought I was an assassin or a spy or something. And also, Jesus Christ Superstar there was an attempt to put it on in Buenos Aires, and right-wing extremists had burnt the theatre down. So I thought, well, if I tell anybody that and that I'm planning to do something on Eva Peron, I don't think I'll get back. I'll be propping up a motorway stanchion somewhere on the M4 out of Buenos Aires. So I kept a low profile. Cowardice is the word I'm looking for.
You did a year's research. She was on a stamp. You'd heard a radio program. That's a lot of research, actually. What surprised you in the story? As you dug deeper, what surprised you that you hadn't, as it were, got from the initial version?
Well, I didn't know that much about her very humble beginnings, because the stamps didn't reveal that. And there was also a very good TV documentary by Carlos Pacini, which told the story of Eva Peron and told the story of her body, which was almost as remarkable as the story of her when she was alive. And there wasn't a lot of stuff. I mean, it was difficult to find stuff, especially in English at the time. Nobody in Britain really had a clue who Eva Peron was. And she'd been dead for 20 years, and she'd never made much of an impact in Britain, even when she was alive, although she had in Spain and other Latin-influenced countries. So there was very little to go on. I did find a book, which I keep meaning to return to Ealing Library, which was about Peron, which obviously had quite a bit about her. And I also found a book called Leaders of Latin America, which featured her and Peron. But there was very little. There was a book which I didn't read, although a lot of people said, yeah, I obviously nicked it, by Mary Main. And there was a lot of stuff, a hell of a lot of stuff, after the success of the show came out about Eva Peron. Lots of books, and hardly any of them mentioned the musical at all, even though the books only came out because of the musical. I mean, I think we did turn her into a figure who everybody in this country knows that she's Argentine and that she was glamorous. And that was about all I knew to begin with. But the more I went into it, the more interesting it became. And a lot of people said at the time, well, this is a bonkers idea for a show because nobody knows the story. But with Superstar, they said it was a bonkers idea for a show because everybody knows the story.
When and how did you come up with the idea of having Che Guevara as the foil? Because part of the genius of the show is that is both historically grounded and also here's another icon. I mean, talk about James Dean. There's another James Dean figure.
That was probably the master stroke, which was luck, really, because looking for English language stuff about Peron, I was too lazy to learn Spanish. There was this book I mentioned, I think, before, called Leaders of Latin America. And there was a chapter on Che Guevara. I read, and the chapter on the Perons was only like 2,000 or 3,000 words, maybe a bit more. And it was in Buenos Aires I was with this book, which I poured out to read on the plane, etc., etc. And there was a chapter on Che Guevara and one or two other characters, Simon Bolivar and one or two others. And I thought, quite interesting, I'll read about them as well. And stone me, Che Guevara was Argentine. I had no idea. I thought he was Cuban. And I didn't know that much about him, except that he was quite keen on starting revolutions almost anywhere. And I discovered that he was Argentine and he was around in Argentina at the time of Eva Peron's years in power, or years in influence, I should say, probably. And this was a wonderful bonus. It was 2 for the price of 1. And so I thought, great, they probably never met. I'm sure they didn't, or if they did, she would not have known who he was because he was a student. So I thought, well, I'd had the idea of having some sort of narrator, a bit like Judas in Superstar, someone who would present the anti-Eva view which of course the soldiers and the army and the aristocrats also did. But I had invented a character who was going to be her hairdresser. But Che Guevara was 20 times more intriguing.
And he was also, I was just reading up about him now, he was also from a well-off family. Eva came from poverty to extraordinary wealth. Che Guevara, he played rugby for the polo club. He could easily have been one of those aristos, and yet he's on every student's wall as the symbol of revolution. It's almost like a perfect antithesis.
It is. I mean, so often the poshos, you see that in politics at a lower level everywhere in this country. It's so often the privileged. They're the ones who can afford to have the liberal views without any worry. If you're down in the dirt and at the bottom level of things, sometimes it's very difficult to be liberal and think, oh, I don't mind who says what, or I don't mind this, that, and the other. I prefer Eva to Che a million times. She struggled up from the bottom. I think he was a bit of a sadist.
Yeah, I was going to say, because Juan Perón is, apart from anything else, without Eva, he's just a stereotypical Latin American strongman, isn't he? I mean, there's not a musical to be written about him. And yet you make him quite soulful at points in this musical.
Well, yes, one or two critics, I'm sure, have said, he doesn't feature enough, but it's not really about him. But as you say, he was a sort of, to a certain extent, a stock dictator. And I certainly think when things looked grim, he was probably more in favor of running out than she was. But of course, he was more privileged. He'd been married before. He was a high flyer in the army. And it was a bit of a dodgy game at the top of the political scene then. And it was a bit of a poison chalice to get up to the very top. But on the other hand, that might be safer than being number 2 or 3. I mean, Perón was a smooth operator. Wasn't no doubt about it. He was a crafty chap, but I wouldn't have wanted him around for tea, I don't think.
As you were saying, she was very little known in this country. She is known now because of your musical. But one of the great numbers in the show is the Rainbow Tour, when he sends her to Europe as the great ambassador of his new Argentina. And as you describe it, her reception is mixed. But she was quite a big deal. When you were writing it, did you get any sense of her standing or reputation outside of the UK? Did you know people in France or Spain? I mean, did you have an idea that it was our Englishness that meant we didn't know about her?
Yes, I did get that. She was clearly a big cheese in Spain and a little bit in Italy. And the Americans were very interested in her as well. I think she was better known in North America than she was in Europe, except for Spain. I've got a couple of Life magazines from the period in which there's articles on her. And these magazines like the Saturday Evening Post, Life, even early versions of Time and Newsweek, they often were really glamour mags posing as intellectual news mags. Maybe that's a bit unfair to some of them, but there were some interesting articles. But of course, it was the fact that she just looked so good in the pictures that helped. And in the early 50s, if you'd said to people, who is Eva Peron in America, the intelligentsia would all know. I'm not sure that's true in London, or would have been then.
And she was a kind of quintessential Paris Match politician as well. I mean, it's a bit like Grace Kelly in a way. I think Grace Kelly and then her family feature in Paris Match, or used to, I don't know anymore, every week. But she's a very un-English subject in a way, because that version of politics suits a way of covering and reporting about politics, which is pretty alien to the British way of thinking about these things. It's an unlikely subject for a British origin musical. That's part of what makes it so wonderful, I think.
Yes, maybe. I don't know. I leave that for other people to decide. But I mean, the thing about Britain is we've always had the glamour of the royal family to stop us. It's not why the royal family are there, but the glamour of the royal family, we don't really need to have necessarily a terribly glamorous political lineup as well. I mean, there have been some, of course. But I think Eva Peron and people like her, and Grace Kelly for that matter, they were almost trying to be political and trying to be something on the international scene outside of entertainment. I mean, that was much more common than the other way around. I mean, they were figures who had showbiz star quality, and they happened to be, well, Grace Kelly was, of course, in showbiz, but Eva certainly, I think, I mean, she tried to be a film star. She might have become, if she'd been a really successful film star, and if she'd done something in a movie that had been a hit in Europe, or even unlikely that it may seem, even in America, I'm not sure she would have worried about being the First Lady of Argentina.
But one of the things that you did by writing this musical was then you created a template through which people compared future very successful, well-known female politicians and others. So one is Margaret Thatcher, who went to see it when it opened in London and loved it. Can I read you the line from the letter that she wrote to Ronnie Miller? So Ronnie Miller, her speechwriter, took her to see it, I think in August 78, so not long after it opened. And she wrote to him saying, "Thank you, that was a completely memorable, magical evening. It was also, I found it quite disturbing," she said. And then she said, I quote to her speechwriter, "If they can do that," and they here I think means the Perons rather than you and Andrew Lloyd-Webber, "if they can do that without any ideals, then if we apply the same perfection and creativeness to our message, our underlined, we should provide good historic material for an opera called Margaret in 30 years' time." Now, she saw something in this. And I'm going to ask you about another politician who saw something in it. Did she ever talk to you about it? Did you know her at all? Did she ever try and talk to you about Evita?
I did meet her a few times, mainly through charitable occasions. I certainly had a few chats with her, but I don't remember particularly talking about Evita. I certainly didn't sit down with Margaret Thatcher at any point and discuss it, no.
So to me, what's so interesting about it, I mean, so Juan Perón is not an ambivalent character. He's probably a nasty piece of work. But she is an ambivalent character. She's deeply attractive in all sorts of ways as a person, as a personality. But also her politics were pretty nasty. And I'm talking about Eva Peron, not Margaret Thatcher, but people would compare Margaret Thatcher to Eva in order to denigrate her. I mean, I remember it as a kind of motif at the time, the implication being she has sort of semi-fascist ambitions or whatever. At the same time, here is Margaret Thatcher herself seeing something in this character. Presumably, she knew nothing about Eva Peron until she saw your musical. And she saw something in that story that really spoke to her. And to me, it's one of the things that's so remarkable about the character of Evita as you created her, that she could be both the person that's used to denigrate Margaret Thatcher and the person that Margaret Thatcher thinks she could aspire to. In this version, Eva has no ideals rather than nasty ideals. But there was something there.
Yeah, I think Eva had some ideals. I mean, she represented her class. She felt that. And she was using her conquest of aspects of the oligarchy to boost her own class and attack the ruling levels of society. And I think a lot of the comparisons that were made between Eva and Margaret at the time weren't necessarily to denigrate Margaret Thatcher. I think a lot of them were saying, wow, she's glamorous like Eva Peron. I mean, she didn't look anything like Eva Peron, and she was a different sort of glamour. But I think, and I often wonder whether the fact that Margaret Thatcher was in charge of the country at the time was probably a big plus for us. The concept of women running important countries was quite new. We tend to forget that now, and the Labour Party have never discovered it. It's strange that if you go back to 1978, when Margaret Thatcher, I'm not sure because she didn't come to power till 79, so she saw the show before she was even...
So she was leader of the opposition when she wrote to Ronnie and said, we could do this.
Yes. Well, maybe we influenced British.
Maybe you changed the course of British. I don't think you won her the election, but something was going on. Can you remember, did people's attitude to the show change when the Falklands War came around? Because then you have our Evita going to war with the country of Evita.
That was extraordinary. I mean, it really was. I mean, there were so many headlines, don't cry for Argentina, or do cry for Argentina, or stand back Buenos Aires. There was one big headline. And it was just weird. I mean, there were two schools of thought on it. One was that it would help the show because it told the story of Argentina, a country about which most people didn't know all that much in England. And on the other hand, it would maybe harm the show because people would feel they were supporting the wrong side by going to see it. It's quite possible that those two views coincided, so it didn't make much difference because there was certainly a restriction on singing Don't Cry For Me Argentina on TV or live shows, and I don't think the record got played very much. And I remember Elaine had recorded a concert. She was part of a big concert at the Albert Hall a couple of weeks before, and she sang Don't Cry For Me Argentina before the war. And when the TV program was shown, a couple of weeks after the war had broken out, that song was cut. So there was obviously a little bit of censorship or unease about the possibility that some people would see the promotion of a song from Evita as a support for the bad guys, Viz Galtieri. I don't remember thinking anything other than we ought to be aware that, well, obviously we were aware that what was going on, and we ought to be prepared for the show suddenly to be shut. I mean, people didn't suggest that because it became almost a contemporary piece. Nowadays, you get so many plays which are hardly plays at all. They're just reworkings of politicians who were talking about something as recently as 2 or 3 years ago, and they're not really plays. Ours was even in 1978, when if Eva had still been alive, she would only be 60 odd in those days. But we were definitely talking about a period of history. But I dare say a lot of people back in 78 might have thought it was either fiction or it was something that had happened only the other day. I don't know. At the end of the day, the show somehow survived it. And that was only, it was about 3 or 4 years into the run, wasn't it? The Falklands War was 82. And it was about halfway through the show's run, actually, yeah.
I remember when Don't Cry For Me, Argentina went to number one, which was before the show had opened. And I was 10, 11 years old, but I was interested in the charts and I listened to Radio 1 a lot. And I was completely baffled as to what this song was about. And I suspect that wasn't just because I was 10. I suspect that was quite widespread, wasn't it? I mean, it's quite an unusual subject for a song to reach number one. It was a great pop song, but it took me quite a long time to work out what on earth it was about. And that also makes it a bit odd that therefore it should be banned during the Falklands, because it had been a number one. It was a pop song, and it's not a rousing propaganda tune or anything. It's quite apart from anything else, it's a very ambivalent song about Argentina.
Yes, what people forget is it was written as a speech, a political speech, and not a very sincere one necessarily. And it was one of those political speeches which we hear all the time in all countries, it sort of sounds quite good, but it doesn't actually say anything. And it was deliberately meant to be that. I mean, Don't Cry For Me, Argentina, why would they cry for her? She's, got to the top. I mean, that was part of her fakeness. She was implying, it's such a strain being up here, but don't worry, I'm all right and I'll look after you. Oh, that's very dishonest. I mean, you can see it all the time, in politics. So it was deliberately a sort of string of cliches. And as for fortune, as for fame, I never invited them in, dripping with jewelry and all that. One critic, cretin, whoever he was, I can't remember who he was, said it was just a string of cliches. Well, that's what it's meant to be. But of course, the fact that it was a number one record, people weren't buying it, analysing it. They just thought, what a lovely record. Great tune, wonderful orchestration, great singer, Judy Covington. And the words sounded nice, sort of what a good political speech is. It doesn't matter what it says. It just sounds good. That's the politician's dream. In fact, the less you can say, the better. But if you actually say it nicely, that's the good bet. So it was out of context. We did not think it would be a hit. We thought it was a good song. But we thought Another Suitcase in Another Hall was much more likely to be a chart hit. And it was, but it was dwarfed by Argentina.
Maybe that's what Margaret Thatcher saw in it. She said, if they can do it without anything, imagine what we can do when we really mean what we say. Who knows?
Absolutely. Yes.
So when the movie was made, I think in 96 by Alan Parker and Madonna, another person who already by that point had been compared to Eva Peron, and a lot of it was filmed in Argentina. Did you get a sense then of what people in Argentina were thinking about either the real Eva Peron or by that point, the fact that she was best known all around the world? One of the ironies of the musical is it begins by saying we're on the front pages of all the world's papers today. It's got to be good for Argentina. But actually, it's because of you that Eva is still an icon.
Yeah, I guess that's true. And articles these days can mention her without having to say the former president's wife of, blah, blah, blah. Yes, I mean, Madonna was the perfect person for it. I mean, people kept saying, we've got to get a great actress. I said, no, you don't need an actress. You want someone who can sell a song. And Madonna was perfect. I mean, I think Madonna can act, but she wasn't really required to in Evita, except through song. And that was her strength.
When you saw it, the fact that a lot of it was set in the actual buildings, they filmed it in Buenos Aires. Did it come across to you as something different from how you'd imagined it? What was it like seeing it set in the place itself?
No, I think it was very realistic. I thought the scenes in the Casa Rosada and the Plaza de Mayo and all that, they were great because it probably did look like that because they were the right places. And, President Menem, obviously, he thought this is quite a good way to help sell the country a bit abroad. And the film did pretty well. I mean, it was quite a successful movie.
And in the film, there is more actual violence. So the thing that you can't create on a West End stage or any stage is the fact that the politics behind this is genuinely nasty. And people describe it. The song at the end of Act 1 makes completely clear that these people are thugs and they are willing to shoot people who don't agree with them. But in the movie, you do actually get a sense, not massively, but enough of a sense, that what lies behind this is pretty nasty stuff. The other person, and it's almost too good to be true, that both Margaret Thatcher and Donald Trump were, and this is in Trump's own words, so the letter I just read you, Thatcher wrote the night after, or the morning after the night before, but Trump, in one of his many autobiographies, says that Evita is his favourite musical. First of all, he says he's a musical theatre fan. Secondly, he says that Evita is his favourite musical. He went to see it, he says, 6 times. And this presumably would have been on Broadway when he was a real estate developer. And he's often referred to it, and he talks about it quite a lot. And he also clearly saw something in it. I mean, I often find myself sort of wondering what Donald Trump saw in Evita that kept drawing him back to it. Have you ever met Donald Trump?
No.
So he's not sought you out for advice about how to become a blonde bombshell politician. But he also, so when he was president, he called AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, he called her Evita. And he used it as a term of praise. So he said of her, she's a nobody and she's got no ideas, but she's got an Evita quality about her, meaning star quality. And Trump called her Evita as one of his nicknames. He likes to give people nicknames. So that was the one he chose for her. And she embraced it. And she called herself Evita. And what they were agreeing about was that she had star quality.
Trump has a sort of star quality. That's not, you wouldn't argue it's very pleasant star quality, but there's no doubt about it. He's very watchable.
His favorite movie when he was president is Sunset Boulevard. So night after night, apparently, he would scream, it's the movie that he loved. I mean, there's something to me about the thought that Donald Trump, well, it's quite weird he became president, but the fact that the president of the United States was both watching Sunset Boulevard and channeling your Evita, I don't know whether to laugh or to cry. Do you want to laugh or cry when you hear that?
It's just weird, it is strange. I think if you're lucky enough to have a hit in any walk of life, in culture or in the media, you sometimes forget that if it's a big hit, virtually everybody will at least have heard of it, including people right at the very top. It is a bit strange when you realize that people like Trump actually spend 5 or 10 seconds every so often thinking about it. But I don't think anything we've done has had any major influence on the world stage. Who knows?
Who knows? We would have to get Donald Trump on to ask him. So the last question, it's had this musical, it's had a life of its own. It's, 46 years on?
Well, the record with Julie Covington's Argentina on it came out in 1976. So it's nearly 50 years, 48 years since the record came out and 46 years since the show with Elaine Page opened.
And it is 50 years since you heard that radio program. So that was, I think you said 74. Do you think differently about it or the subject matter of it? So you stumbled upon this story. It's this extraordinary story that surprisingly to most people, but you turn into this magical musical. And then you create a character, Evita, who becomes what the world knows of Eva Peron. Do you ever find yourself thinking about the real Eva Peron? Do you think differently about her? Has your view of her changed over these 50 years?
I don't think it's changed enormously. I think she probably was capable of one or two fairly unpleasant things. But I'm sure if one met her, one would be entranced and, captivated, because she's obviously a very good manipulator. It would be maybe difficult to approach her with a totally balanced viewpoint. I mean, I would love to have met her. I rather wish I'd made a bit of an effort to meet one of her sisters who was still alive when we did the show. But I was probably terrified of being assassinated or something. I don't know.
And it is one of those stories that depends on her dying young. And she could have lived another 50 years. I mean, there is a version of the Eva Peron story. And the other person, I suppose, in the life of Evita, who was sometimes compared to her, was Princess Diana. And those lives are completely different when lived to the end, as it were. And presumably, had she been alive, for instance, you wouldn't have been writing a musical about her. It did require her not to be around.
She probably would have had, there would have been a second part to her life. And she would have, almost certainly, would have been basically fairly tragic or fairly unsuccessful or fairly unpleasant. So leaving the stage when she did was quite a good move. She never even knew that Peron was on the skids. She knew that things weren't going perfectly, but in our version, certainly she still thinks, well, I can overcome this. I've overcome incredible odds before in getting to where I got to. So we mustn't give up, which is towards the end of our show. The conversations that Peron and she must have had would have been very interesting, in private, with all their enemies closing in around them.
And finally, I'm aware this is an impossible question to answer, but Eva Peron is in the eyes of most of the world now, you're Evita. And presumably she was a woman, as you described her, who was quite keen on fame. And you gave her a fame beyond anything she could have dreamt of. Do you ever find yourself thinking about what would the real Eva Peron have felt about the fact that actually she will live forever now, but she will live forever because of your musical?
Well, maybe not forever, but certainly for a long time.
Well, a lot longer than she would have done.
I've often said that the show was a much more accurate assessment of Eva than the intellectual books about her, the sort of serious historian view, which often has got some interesting facts. But basically, I think Eva would have loved the show. I'm not sure she'd have liked most of the books that were written about her quite as much.
And what do you think the show got right that the books got wrong? I mean, is it that the show, apart from anything else, makes her a completely, in incredibly brief lyrics, makes her a fully rounded human being that intellectual biographies rarely do of their subjects?
Well, I think that's very kind of you to say so, if that's true. I think the show is entertaining. I think whenever you think about Eva Peron, is the music so strong, and some of the versions, notably Hal Prince's original production, are so good that you just think, I've really got to see this. I've really got to see it through to the end. Whereas, I've got 15 or 20 books on Eva Peron. I haven't even read all of them, but virtually none of them mention the musical at all. It's as if, they were going to write the book anyway, which I'm sure they wouldn't have done. So I think the show will be in a very important part in the Eva Peron Museum, for example, in Buenos Aires, which I've been around a couple of times, is much closer to the show than it is to any of the books. It's almost as if they used our show as a script, I felt. You went through, Hunin, and then, her becoming a radio star, then a film star, and then all that.
I mean, the only comparable example to this is Hamilton. I mean, Alexander Hamilton will now be known. I mean, it seems to me these two musicals are quite similar in that respect, in that they've taken very important historical figures, but the result of these two musicals is that those historical figures will now be known in a different way. I mean, I say forever, but, as long as people are interested in these things. And I can't think of anything else that's done that, actually.
No, Superstar, our hero in that one was quite well known before.
Quite well known and sort of transcends it a bit. But you and Lin-Manuel Miranda, you have transcended the subject matter, actually.
Well, Lin-Manuel, I've met him a couple of times. I don't know him very well, but he's often said very politely, and I think genuinely, that both Superstar and Evita influenced him enormously. And, he did a great job. And I'd never really heard of Alexander Hamilton. I knew the name was vaguely. And that's true for a lot of Americans as well. They didn't know too much about him. And I'm not sure I'd get A-level in Hamilton even now, but his legacy has been transformed by the musical, which struck me as, being very, very clever way. It's a great way of telling history. They should do a little bit more about that in schools.
I totally agree. That is the last of our Great Political Fictions episodes for now. We will be returning, but we have a new series starting, and it's about historical counterfactuals, the what-ifs of history, the forks in the road when something very small at least had the potential to create a completely different world. And we're going to be talking about a whole series of these counterfactuals. We're starting with a conversation with Adam Rutherford, the geneticist and science writer, about counterfactuals in science and whether they make sense. But we're also going to be talking about one particular discovery in 1913 that probably did change the history of the world. We also have a new bonus episode available now on PPF Plus. You will need to subscribe to hear it. Just go to ppfideas.com or click on the link in the show description. And it is the link between the series that we've been doing on Great Political Fictions and the series we're about to do on counterfactuals, because it is the great counterfactual novel about American politics. Philip Roth's The Plot Against America, which imagines a different America if the outcome of the 1940 presidential election had been different. It imagines a fascist America. You can read more about that, including about counterfactuals in American presidential history, in our latest newsletter. That's available now. If you haven't subscribed, it's easy. Just click on the link in the show description and you can sign up for that too. It's free. It comes out every fortnight. Next time, Adam Rutherford on counterfactuals in science. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.